So I'm going to give an update of Jakarta E9, where we are in our planning. So I'm obviously the founder of Pyara. I'm also one of the project leads on the Jakarta E platform, and for the Jakarta E9 release, I'm what we're calling a co-pilot with Kevin Sutter from IBM. So we're currently in the phase of putting together and the plan that will go in for review to both the steering committee and the specification committee, just to go through a bit of the process. So I did a similar update a month ago, and this is really going to follow on from that as some more decisions have been made since then. Just to recap a little bit of where we are. So Jakarta E8 was out in September, and that was the compatibility release. So that was based in the Java X namespace. And the big thing is that we have open specifications that are managed through the Eclipse Foundation specification process, and we have an open source TCK, an open source development process. And so that completed the evolution of the specifications, the APIs from the JCP. And now we're in the phase of creating Jakarta E9. So for Jakarta E9, we're sort of targeting this as a tooling release. And I've got a little bit about what we mean by that. But it's going to be a limited scope in that what we're going to do is change the namespace to the Jakarta namespace. We're going to deprecate and remove some APIs, and we've got some slides on which APIs are remaining, which ones are we deprecating, and which ones we're adding. And also we're going to update the base JDK. And in parallel to a large extent to that, we can also start thinking about Jakarta E10. So Jakarta E10 will be the first feature release, and the projects now for all the APIs, as I said earlier, are all in the Eclipse Foundation, and we can start working on those now while we're also at the same time creating the sort of Jakarta E9 tooling release. So the reason we're sort of saying it's a tooling release is that we're not adding any specifications other than some that have been pruned from from Java SE8. We're not really looking to make any breaking changes, so we're not introducing any new APIs, no breaking changes other than the namespace, obviously, and maybe some upward compatible changes where they're small. But predominantly it's the move from JavaX to Jakarta that we'll be completing in the API package names. So what we wanted to do was create a base for people to sort of target when they're dealing with the namespace change. So Jakarta E9 release will really give time for IDEs to build some tooling to help move applications that target the old Jakarta E8 JavaX namespace to migrate and target the Jakarta namespace. Similarly, it gives us an opportunity for vendors like Pyara to explore how we sort of also help end users and developers move this move across the namespaces and make their transition as smooth as possible. So we can look at explore compatibility layers. We can collaborate with other vendors on how we can build compatibility layers to support old applications running on Jakarta E9. And then finally, also end users and developers out there, they can start taking these APIs, test and move their applications onto the new namespace, knowing that none of the behavior has changed. So any problems they encounter will likely be only due to the namespace, and may potentially support for that namespace change within their tools. One of the things making Jakarta E9, one of the other key things is to do it as soon as possible. So we can get this tooling release out reasonably quickly and then move on to Jakarta E10. So if you've been on the previous call, we were still in a flux and what is the scope of Jakarta E9, which APIs are in, which APIs are out. And there's been a lot of chatter on the platform mailing lists. And based on the call this Tuesday, we're in a position where we believe that this is all agreed. It's still got to be put into the release plan and still got to be signed off, but most of the discussions have now been settled. So what we're going to do is prune a number of legacy APIs, and they'll be removed completely from Jakarta E9. We're going to add in some APIs that used to be in Java SE8, but are no longer there. So they were pruned from SE, and we're going to add those in as optional APIs into Jakarta E9. And again, I've got more slides on this. We're also then going to move all APIs to the Jakarta namespace, including those ones that we've added from Java SE8. And to make this more consistent, we are going to specify that to get platform compatibility, an application server or runtime must certify on Java SE11. This is so because there's a lot of debate around the APIs that have been pruned from 8 and what to do with them, whether to leave them in the JavaX namespace or move them to Jakarta. And we thought if we set the baseline as SE11, it was cleaner and more consistent to say that we're adding them in and we're adding those in at the Jakarta namespace. If we'd left the baseline at SE8, then obviously they would exist in Java SE and in Jakarta EE, which could be confusing. So we've taken the opportunity by bringing these in to also uprev the minimum for compatibility. Saying that though, we're going to require that API jars are released so they're suitable for use with JDKA individually. So what that means is that they will be compiled using Java SE8 class file format. So we're not going to compile them into Java SE11 class file format, as we know the API jars are often used widely outside there in the general ecosystem. And there's no need, given we're not allowing any API changes of any significance, to not do this, because no one is going to be pushing to put SE11 only APIs into their API signatures. So just to move on to actually the details of each specification. So what we're pruning is we're pruning Jakarta XML registries, RPC, and deployment and management APIs, which are all very old. And we're also removing support for distributed interoperability in EJB 3.2, which is the sort of CORBA IIOP aspects, as again, CORBA and IIOP is no longer in the JDK. So that's what we've agreed on removing. We're also making a couple of APIs optional. Jakarta Enterprise Beans 2.x, which is the old EJB, that was optional previously and remain optional. We decided not to prune it because it's quite complex, and it would have delayed the project due to the mix and match of namespaces and exception hierarchies and things between the current EJB and the older EJBs. So doing that unpicking work was too complicated. And we're also pruning the old enterprise web services, which is the web service that predates the XML web services, or JAX WS as was. And the other thing, there's a lot of debate around optional APIs because part of the specification process requires that the compatible implementation will support all these APIs. So even though to get compatibility, something like Pyara doesn't need to implement these APIs, when we actually release the specification, then the implementation that goes along with the specification release has to support all these. So there's a burden on the specification team and the compatible implementation to support optional APIs. But at the same time, we still meet our goals, which is to sort of reduce the footprint of Jakarta E9 for new vendors. So new vendors wouldn't need to support any of these optional APIs. So there was a lot of debate around these APIs as they've been pruned from Java SE8, and therefore, officially went Jakarta APIs. And the conversation has gone back and forth probably for about 3 weeks. And we've eventually come to the conclusion that we will add all these APIs into Jakarta EE9, albeit most of them will be optional. So Jakarta activation will be added into Jakarta E9. That supports Java Mail, and that will be mandatory. And then Java JAX-B as was, Jakarta XML binding, or JAX-WS as was, which is Jakarta XML web services, and their other associated web services APIs and specifications. They'll now all be added into Jakarta E9 as optional APIs. And in addition to that, we're going to move all these 5 APIs into the Jakarta namespace. That was really driven by community feedback. So there was a lot of community feedback that these APIs are still in a lot of use, and they wanted to see them move into Jakarta namespace. Again, from a specification point of view, it was a burden to support these and move them. However, because of the community feedback, we decided to take that work on and bring them into Jakarta E9 to provide a solid base as to where these APIs have gone, and that they will be available to applications in runtimes that support them. Again, that does add a lot of work into the compatible implementation, as it needs to implement these APIs and support these APIs. So that covers what we're adding, removing, what's in and what's out of E9. So just and then E9, as we said, will be based on Java SE11 for implementations. And then, so if we move into the planning, so we haven't got full dates for this, but what we'll be doing is, from a project plan perspective, we're moving forward in 7 waves. So essentially, this is a rough view of what depends on what. So, from the first wave will be the lowest level APIs that have the minimal dependencies. So that includes Jakarta concurrency, annotations, messaging, as was JMS. And then wave 2 again brings in some other APIs that may, depend on wave 1. Then we bring in the big one, which is Jakarta context and dependency injections in wave 3. And then, following on for that is further and further, higher and higher APIs that depend on the most lower level APIs. So after each wave, we'll do a release review and check our progress against our plans. We don't have any dates for these yet, but we're targeting to agree some of these next week. And the Jakarta E9 is, very much, there's a fixed quantum of work that needs to be done. So we have to pick a date when that work can be finished. When we move into maybe E10, 11 and beyond, then we can follow a more release train mode, whereby we'd be able to pick a date for the release and then just pick up the APIs that are ready at that date and release a platform that way. But for E9, we have to do all this namespace change, so the quantum of work is fairly fixed. Hence the sort of debates around scope. Finally, in wave 7, we'll put out the full and web platform specifications, as they obviously reference all the lower level ones. So when it comes to API jars, we're going to try and get those out earlier than suggested from the wave diagram. So essentially, when I say artifact, I'm talking about jar files, really, for most people. So we're going to release RC, so release candidate API jars, as soon as possible into Maven Central, without going through the full spec process and everything. So that essentially they'll be available for later waves, and tooling and Glassfish, Eclipse Glassfish, from which I'm a project lead of, can use those jars early, as early as possible. And that will speed up the delivery. So we won't have to release, won't have to wait for full wave 1 release artifacts be available at, final versions in Maven Central before we can do Wave 2. We'll basically do the namespace change, push out a release candidate jar into Maven Central, and then we can move on to Wave 2 and Wave 3 and beyond, etc. Individual specs, because obviously I'm just on the platform project, which is an umbrella. Each of those can release a final specification at any time, subject to them following the Eclipse specification process. Another step we're aiming to do is once all the API jars have been released, we're intending to do like a release candidate of the full platform. So that will include the API jars, a compatible implementation, and the TCK, but it won't have gone through the full spec process. All the documents necessarily won't be ready. And that'll give an opportunity for us to look at tooling and make sure that everything's working before we then have a sort of a window, which may be a couple of months, where we'll then do the final release and put the final artifacts up into Maven Central and all the specification documents, etc., and go through the formal votes and IP flow, etc. We're looking at a date in Q2 2020 for the final release, and that means we'll be looking for an RC date, probably Q1 2020. To get some API jars in people's hands so that they can play with them and target implementations, etc. So again, these dates are going to get a bit more nailed down in the next week. We have to give a projected date by next Tuesday, I believe, just before Christmas, and we'll put that into a release plan. So that's where we are. We have the scope nailed down. We have a tentative quarter that we're going to release things on, and we have a plan in the sense we have the order of things that are going to happen. The only thing we're now missing is the date. Anybody can contribute. There's a lot of this conversations on the platform dev mailing list, on the community list. To get to a date, I'll just show that we are putting together tracking on a spreadsheet of when APIs can move to the namespace. And what you'll see is actually most of the Wave 1 APIs, PRs are already done, and some of them are already merged. Actually doing the API change itself is not a big deal. Getting the implementations and the TCK will be a bigger deal. But we've already making progress on this, and I say many of the PRs for Wave 1 are already done. Once we can get those into Maven Central as release candidate, then the API changes can be done on Wave 2. And then some of the TCK work can then follow on. Basically, we just need artifacts for these. So anybody can get involved. Some of the PRs have been done by people who aren't sort of usual suspects, if you like. It's quite easy to do. It's just on GitHub. Each project has a GitHub repository, and you can start help making the PRs. You can raise issues. And like I said, probably at the beginning, is Jakarta E10 itself can also start progressing. And I'm project lead for concurrency, and we're already creating issues for that in the separate branches, and that can work in parallel to the API work. So a lot of the namespace work is just sort of boilerplate type work. So the innovative work can happen in parallel. So I just wanted to stress that as well. So that's all I've got. Is there any questions?